Imagine a world where the very elements that sustain life, the sun, the rain, the oceans, turn hostile. This is not a distant dystopian future for everyone. For millions across the globe, it is the lived reality of today, while the drivers of climate change are largely rooted in the action of industrialized nations. Its most brutal consequences are disproportionately felt by those least responsible, the world's most vulnerable population. From the parched lands that can no longer yield sustenance to the rising tides that swallow homes whole, the climate crisis is not a uniform trait. It is the magnifying glass held to existing inequalities, depending the chasm between the haves and the have-nots, and demanding we confront not just a planetary emergency, but a profound social injustice. Climate change, driven by human activities that release greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, is a global phenomenon with far-reaching consequences. While its effects are felt worldwide, they are not experienced equally. Vulnerable populations, including low-income communities, indigenous groups, women, children, and those living in climate-sensitive regions, bear a disproportionate burden of the adverse impacts of climate change. This inequity raises critical, ethical, and social justice concerns demanding urgent attention and targeted solutions. So the main points of climate change is number one, increased exposure to climate hazards. So the data scientific reports from the Internal Governmental Panel on Climate Change or IPCC consistently show that certain regions such as population are more exposed to climate hazards such as extreme heat, flooding, droughts, and sea level rise. For instance, small island developing states or CIDS are exceptionally vulnerable to sea level rise and storm surge, while communities in arid and semi-arid regions face increased risk of water scarcity and desertification. In the Philippines, coastal communities in areas like Eastern Samar are repeatedly devastated by increasingly intense typhoons. Examples: imagine a low-lying coastal community in Bangladesh facing displacement and loss of livelihoods due to frequent and severe flooding caused by rising sea levels. Or consider indigenous communities in the Arctic whose traditional ways of life are disrupted by melting ice and changes in wildlife patterns. In this anecdote, Aling Ray is resident of Coastal Barangay in the Philippines recounted how her family has had rebuilt her home multiple times after power typhoon destroyed it. So she worries constantly about the next storm and the increasing unpredictability of the weather, highlighting the heightened vulnerability of coastal communities to extreme weather events. For number two is reduced capacity to cope and adapt. So the data is vulnerable population often have limited resources and capacities to cope with and to adapt the impacts of the climate change. This includes financial constraints, lack of access of information and technology, inadequate infrastructure, and marginalization in decision-making processes. So the studies have shown that the economic losses from climate-related disaster are significantly higher as a percentage of GDP in compared to the nations. Examples: consider a drought-stricken farming community in sub-Saharan Africa that lacks access to irrigation system or drought-resistant crops, making them highly accessible to food insecurity. Or think about informal settlement in residents in a major city who are more vulnerable to heat waves due to inadequate housing and limited access to cooling mechanism. So the anecdote is Tatay Len, a small-scale farmer, shared how consequently years of drought has decimated his crops and depleted his savings. So he lacks the financial means to invest in water-efficient farming techniques or alternative livelihoods. So leaving this family in a precarious situation, this illustrates the limited adaptive capacity of many vulnerable agricultural communities. So for number 3, exacerbation of existing inequalities. So the data of climate change acts a threat multiplier exacerbating existing social, economic, and health inequalities. For example, climate-related disaster can displace population, so leading to increased competition for resources and social unrest. Changes in agricultural productivity can worsen food insecurity and malnutrition, disproportionately affecting low-income households. The World Health Organization, who has highlighted how climate change impact exacerbate health disparities, with vulnerable population facing higher risk of heat stroke or respiratory illnesses and vector-borne diseases. Examples: imagine a scenario where a climate-induced water scarcity crisis leads to conflict over dwindling resources in a region already grappling with ethnic tensions. Or consider how increased air population due to climate change and fossil fuel combustion disproportionately affects children and individuals with pre-existing respiratory condition in low-income urban areas. So the anecdote of this, during a severe heat wave in a density populated low-income neighborhood, health workers observed a significant increase in heart stroke cases, particularly among elderly residents living in poorly ventilated homes without air conditioning. So this starkly contrasts with wealthier neighborhoods where residents have the means to stay cool, highlighting how climate change intensifies existing health inequalities. The conclusion of the climate change, the disproportionate impacts of climate change on vulnerable population is a grave injustice that demands immediate and comprehensive actions. These communities, who often contribute the least to greenhouse gas emissions, are bearing the brunt of its devastating consequences. Addressing the issues requires a commitment to climate justice, which entails not only in mitigating greenhouse gases emissions, but also prioritizing adoption measures that specifically target the needs of vulnerable populations. This includes investing in resilient infrastructure, promoting climate-smart agriculture, ensuring access to essential services, and empower marginalized communities to participate in climate decision-making processes. Recognizing and addressing the differentiated vulnerabilities to climate change is crucial for building a more just and sustainable future for all. Climate change is not just an environmental challenge, it is a profound societal issue that exacerbates existing inequalities.